Hi, I'm Max Kaiser, and this is the Kaiser Report. Drunken stupors, fat fingers, unwitting Americans. Stacey Herbert, tell us more.
Well, Max, first, it's just the end of the second quarter, so I'm going to give you the data. This is a tweet from the Wall Street Journal. Data for the second quarter of 2010, which ended today. NASDAQ down 12%, S&P 500 down 11.9%, Dow down 10%. Notice, however, Max, that they failed to mention this chart. This is the second quarter chart for gold, up well over 10%.
Yeah, because most of the insiders and big money around the world watch this show. You don't need to be an alleged spy to know that gold's going higher.
Well, Americans, of course, wouldn't know because they're not told. So here we have study. Once America started waterboarding, newspapers stopped calling it torture. So this is a Harvard study, and they looked at papers back to the 1930s in America. And anytime the papers referred to waterboarding, they called it torture. That is, up until 2004. From 2002 through 2008, the studied newspapers almost never referred to waterboarding as torture. So as an example, the New York Times characterized it as torture 81.5% of the time prior to 2004, and only 1.4% of the time after 2004.
Propaganda.
It is propaganda, but it's also the citizens of America are then have no idea that they're torturing. So they're told instead that all these people hate us for our freedom.
That's right. The reason all those people hate them is because they're torturing them.
Exactly, but they won't know because the media, which is supposed to be doing the job of providing information to Americans what their governments and politicians are doing.
Well, I remember the New York Times held back on that wiretapping story before the last Bush election, and that was really the end of the New York Times as far as I'm concerned. They are totally in bed with the Pentagon and the monopolists.
Well, here's some more unwitting Americans. Fed made taxpayers unwitting junk bond buyers. So Federal Reserve Chairman Ben S. Bernanke and then New York Fed President Timothy Geithner told senators on April 3rd, 2008 that the tens of billions of dollars in assets the government agreed to purchase in the rescue of Bear Stearns were investment grade. They didn't share everything the Fed knew about the money.
Right. You know, Stacey, you and I have been talking about this stuff for several years now, and at the time, we made it clear to anyone who wanted to get the facts that what they were getting over there in the Fed was Obama dollars. This is an Obama dollar here. This is an Obama dollar. You know, it's Obama's. You can be combined by the truckload here for 50 cents for a bushel. It's junk. It's garbage. The Fed has junk, garbage, garbage. It's all garbage. Obama dollars are worthless.
Well, according to the article, Bloomberg says the so-called assets included collateralized debt obligations and mortgage-backed bonds and $16 billion of credit default swaps, and taxpayers wound up guaranteeing high-yield, high-risk junk bonds. And remember, we're talking about the media's involvement in this. Remember, James Cramer from CNBC Financial News had the most famous moment of the financial crisis when he was shouting at Ben Bernanke, basically because of Bear Stearns. Remember, he was like, I'm speaking to people at Bear Stearns, you've got to come rescue them.
All right. So here you have a situation where in America now, waterboarding is not torture, but a collateralized debt obligation somehow is worth more than an Obama piece of toilet paper.
And here's a quote on this story. Senator Sherrod Brown, an Ohio Democrat and member of the Senate Banking Committee, said this regarding Timothy Geithner and Ben Bernanke buying these junk bonds on behalf of the taxpayer. Either the Fed did not understand the distressed state of some of the assets that it was purchasing from banks, and it is only now discovering their true value, or it understood that it was buying weak assets and attempted to obscure the fact.
Stacey, the reason why this global economy is still deflating, and while none of the so-called stimulus packages are working, is because the Fed willingly took hundreds of billions, if not trillions, of toxic garbage off the commercial banks' balance sheets and called it, 100 cents on the dollar. It's not even worth 1 penny on the dollar. And they still have yet to reveal hundreds of billions, probably trillions more, of worthless paper, which means that no matter what the Federal Reserve or the global banking system throws at this economy, it's never going to re-stimulate because they've got way more toxic debts on their balance sheet. So it's a total fraud. It continues apace.
But also, when America is doing this, when they're bailing out the banks, it's free market capitalism. And it's still, the Americans still consider their system free market capitalism. So when they see G20 protesters or IMF protesters, they think these people are anti-capitalist. They call them anti-capitalist.
Right.
When they themselves are the anti-capitalist.
Again, a total misuse of language. These people are not anti-capitalist. They're anti-feudalism. As America slips down into becoming a neo-feudal state of monarchs and oligarchs who have confiscated the nation's wealth, the wealth of the nation is now zero. To paraphrase Adam Smith, and these people are protesting their return to indentured servitude and debt peonage.
And then here's some more unwittingness, okay? So America spends $1.1 billion in the last 2 years on fighting the war on drugs in Mexico alone. And 22,000 Mexicans have been slaughtered in this war on drugs. Headline reads, banks financing Mexico gangs admitted in Wells Fargo deal. So Wells Fargo, which bought Wachovia in 2008, has admitted in court that its unit failed to monitor and report suspected money laundering by narcotics traffickers. The bank declined to answer specific questions, including how much it made by handling $378.4 billion in illicit drug money.
Let's go back to 2008. I want you to Google this. If you recall, during the height of the financial crisis of 2008, what eventually the banks had to do to roll over their short-term paper was draw on the drug cartel money. They actually had to contact the major kingpin drug cartel leaders for a cash call.
This was information from either the UN or the IMF that the only liquidity at a certain point being provided was from drug money. But also in America, the American population themselves, they're very engaged in the war on drugs, and they're happy for the government and the DEA to seize the assets of people who get caught with like a few flakes of marijuana. But here's what happened to Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo promised in the Miami federal courtroom to revamp its detection systems. If Wells Fargo keeps its pledge, the U.S. government will, according to the agreement, drop all charges against the bank in March 2011.
Wow, what a penalty. Look, the war on drugs is bogus, because if they really wanted to stop the drug trade, they would stop the money laundering trade, and it's easy enough to do that because it's all clearly documented through the various avenues that money flows internationally.
Well, according to the article, no big U.S. bank, Wells Fargo included, has ever been indicted for violating the Bank Secrecy Act or any other federal law. Instead, the Justice Department settles criminal charges by using deferred prosecution agreements, in which a bank pays a fine and promises not to break the law again. They promptly do break the law again in a different capacity.
Right, deferred prosecution means never prosecute. Deferred until never.
Jake Blum, a U.S. Senate investigator for 14 years, says large banks are protected from indictments by a variant of the too big to fail theory. There's no capacity to regulate or punish them because they're too big to be threatened with failure, he says. They seem to be willing to do anything that improves their bottom line until they're caught.
Right. How's that different than having kings and monarchs totally rule a society in debt peonage? Please, let's move on.
So this takes me on to the final story along these rogue bankers with fat fingers. Some of them are actually in a drunken stupor. How a broker spent $520 million in a drunken stupor and moved the global oil price. So PVM oil futures trader Steve Perkins bought 7 million barrels of crude in a late-night trading binge on his laptop, costing $520 million. Well, he was found guilty of improper trading by the FSA, the Financial Services Authority in the UK, fined £73,000. They didn't want to charge him more because they didn't want to cause him financial hardship, they said. And they banned him for 5 years from trading in the UK. It
brings to the fore this model that when these speculators make a mistake, the society has to bail them out. The losses are socialized. When they make a gain on their lucky bets, they get to keep the profits.